Just going to slide this out of the way. Great. Well, it's an honor to be here. I'm really excited to share with you some of the early evidence and signals really that we're seeing from the field of youth leadership development. And before we even really get into that and the importance of doing youth leadership development, I want to pull apart the word leadership just a little bit, because leadership means a million different things around the room. I would bet every single person in here, if they were to define leadership, would define it in a different way. And so if we think about leadership, the story that I find most funny as I've explored what leadership means comes from when we were doing some informational interviews in India. We were outside of the capital, Delhi, and we ended up asking someone there, we said, what does leadership mean to you? And it was translated into the native tongue there, and then it came back and it was leadership equals corrupt politician. So this has a little bit of significance for somebody who works in the field of leadership development, and it has a little bit extra significance when you work for an organization called the Center for Creative Leadership. So what I do is creative corrupt politician training. Okay, so on to a little bit more of a serious note. The way I actually define leadership development is I think about leadership development as being transformative experiences. And when you look at the image that's up here on the screen, I think of this young boy, doesn't matter what age, who is just inspired. He's enthralled at what's going on at that moment. I think of somebody who goes through a leadership development experience, regardless of your age. If you're somebody who's an adult, they come out of some of our programs and they say, man, that was so transformative. And boy, I got to go quit my job. Not something a corporation or an employee wants to hear, but that's something you hear from them. And then you hear about other young people who maybe are in college, they go through their first leadership development experience, and they end up saying, boy, I've really learned what I want to do. I want to go in this direction. I want to make a difference in the world. Or another story as we were out there is we heard from a young girl who was 15, and she had created some significant change, and she's like, boy, if I only got this a couple of years ago. So a little bit of my story, and the question that I'm kind of chasing in this field of doing youth leadership development is, what would the world look like if young people everywhere had access to leadership development? And this question actually stems out of some of the work that I've done globally and personal experiences, but more importantly, it started to come about when I was in Sri Lanka. I was working with the YMCA there. I was a world service worker, and this was back in 2004. My wife and I went over there, and we were tasked with developing a whole bunch of leadership development opportunities. And when we were there, the tsunami came through. And so personally, I of course learned an incredible amount about that experience. But what I heard the 6 months before the tsunami that we were there is I heard the incredible hunger from the young people there that were just dying to step up. And they were experiencing some of the leadership programs, and that was really helping them to step into a new space. Now, I was also doing a secretary's training program there, and that's synonymous with directors here in the United States. And so these directors, as the tsunami came through, they actually were tapped into significant leadership roles regionally, where they needed to respond and work with different organizations, different communities, different people. They needed to empower people on the grassroots there responding to the tsunami. Now, with even more significance, it was very enlightening for me to actually hear a few years later when I went back to interview many of them, that they pointed back to their leadership development experience and said, this is what enabled me to step up and respond during that time of need. And so the story that I hope you're hearing is that this affects people on a very, very fundamental individual level, and it helps them start to think about, well, maybe how can I do something in the broader context of the world? When I came back from Sri Lanka, I was searching for where I can fulfill this question. And I ended up finding my way to the Center for Creative Leadership, and it was this new initiative that CCL was starting, Leadership Beyond Boundaries, and it was about how can we democratize leadership development? How can we bring it to new audiences around the world? How can we unlock human potential? And so we were working with IDEO and Continuum, two lead design firms in the world. And they said, get out of the ivory tower, get out of that research institution that you work in, and go out there. If you want to work with new people, figure out what's going on there, learn, see how you can design something that would actually be appropriate for those people that you'd be working with. And so as we started to consider new audiences, we actually had heard, even before we went out there, from people that come through CCL's programs, as they said, man, I wish I got this 20 years ago. These are mid-level executives and organizations, and they're like, if I had this when I was in college, boy, I could have taken a different path. And then it does play out as we interviewed and talked to people in Africa and Central and Eastern Europe, in India where I was, and then even in the United States with that 15-year-old girl that said, boy, if I only got this a couple of years ago, I could have done so much more. And so maybe the first signal that we start to hear and we should start to think about is, well, when do you start developing the capacity for people to step up and lead? Is that in, when you're in work? Is that when you're in college? Is that when you're in high school? Is that when you're in middle school? Is that when you're in elementary school? So when do you start doing this? And so as we came back from some of these places around the world interviewing all sorts of people, the direction was clearly you need to be doing early leadership development. And so we partnered with the YMCA in Greensboro, where our location is, and we started to think about, well, if leadership development benefits many people, how can we develop a program that would benefit multiple people involved? So thinking of a layered leadership program that's actually generative, and everyone involved actually learns and grows. And so we designed a leadership and mentoring program for the Black and Latino Achievers program in Greensboro. And of course, youth, it had significant impact on them. But then it also had this impact on the mentors that were there. And to explain a little bit more of the program was designed so that the leadership curriculum was the bridge. It was what actually bonded and connected the mentors and the youth. So together, they were engaging in a conversation. They were going through a meaning-making process around what is it like to lead? What is it like to work together as teams? What does leadership mean to me? How do I develop more communication skills? And together, they were actually able to learn and grow. And the chart on the bottom actually references how, for the mentors, it increased their effectiveness at work, at school, with family, with friends, and in the community. And so sometimes, as we know, adults are a little bit of the barrier, but if we can help adults start to think about wearing a mentoring and coaching hat, then they can actually support young people in their development as they're learning and growing. So as we were out there listening, starting to think about how we can contribute, another signal that we continued to hear was we had a lot of youth leadership, youth development organizations that were reaching out to us and saying, boy, CCL, with all of your research that you have, I think you all could really help and actually host something that would bring the field together a little bit. And so since CCL's historic work has really been with adult leadership development, adult education, we partnered up with Search Institute, and we hosted a youth leadership summit this past March. So of course, Search Institute does a whole lot with developmental assets and is really well known in the youth development field. And so we partnered with them to host this, and we had people like YUSA there, we had City Year, we had Kiwanis, we had Rotary. We did not, of course, have them all there, but it was a good start of bringing the community together and responding to what a lot of the youth development organizations were saying is, please come help us and think about how we can reach more people. So as we went into it, the focus was around how do we figure out how to reach more people? How do we understand what's being done out there in the field of youth leadership development? What can we do to start to form best practices? What can we do to, of course I said earlier, reach more people? And so coming out of that, a couple of outcomes took place is, yes, we want to stay connected. We do want to explore the best practices. We want to think about maybe even how we might evaluate the field. And we also recognize that there's an incredible amount of confusion with what leadership means in the field of youth development, youth leadership development. And so, getting a little light show here. Great, because this is important stuff. So, Coming out of it, another area was educational institutions was something to focus in on. And the two areas that I'm going to focus in on for a few minutes is the consistent model and language and educational institutions. So consistent model and language is something that can really be a huge barrier. So if you're in an organization and we have a couple of people that are thinking about leadership in a different way, and we're trying to develop some young people as leaders, and one person is thinking leaders are born, and one people are thinking leaders are made, well, if both of those people are working with me and I'm that young person, I'm getting pretty confused. And if we can't figure out how to evaluate it so that we can be selecting leaders or helping people move on, then there's a whole lot of confusion within the system. And so as we, and when I say we, it's a broader we than just CCL, we're starting to think about, leadership development is about understanding self. It's about how can I understand myself to pursue a path of passion? What are my values? What's my leadership philosophy? What do I want to do in the world? And so this starts to get into the place of leading self. And this is a leader development kind of category. How do I lead myself? And then on the other side of that is understanding others. And so I want you to recognize that all of those first three components can actually be tied together: understanding self, leading self, and understanding others. Because by understanding more about other people in the world, you're also understanding a bit more about yourself and how to lead yourself, maybe how to become a global citizen. And then the other piece is, how do you lead with others? Thinking of this interdependent world that we all live in with incredible challenges out there. How do we learn to live with people with different faiths, different cultural backgrounds? So educational institutions, I want to reference, because if you think about trying to do something on scale, there's perhaps no better spot than really to be plugging in. And educational institutions are actually really starting to think about, well, how do we do leadership development and actually weave it into the very fabric of the educational experience. So we're working with a couple of organizations. One's a K through 12 organization in Raleigh, North Carolina. It's called Ravenscroft. And they have reached out to us and said, hey, listen, how can we do this? But of course, the first thing you'll hear from teachers is that they're overworked. They have too many other things going on. They're used to a traditional system of teaching, and leadership development is much more about a facilitated process. But so we've started to think about how can we weave it in to make it complementary to the educational experience. And so Ravenscroft is one organization that's starting to do that. And then Southern Methodist University is also thinking about how do we provide leadership development to every single undergraduate engineer student. That's 750 students. So huge implications there, and trying to figure out how you do it is the question. But getting back to the mental shift that might need to take place with teachers and with those people that are working with youth, is we introduced a program into a freshman year design course at a university, and we had young people start to think about their leadership philosophy for life. And as they went through it, the teachers were blown away. They stopped thinking about these students as 12th year students or just 13-year students, and they actually started to see and connect with these students on a whole different level that was going to enable them to actually fulfill the rest of the school year. So one last thing is, if we're actually thinking about how can we unlock the potential of young people, of how can we empower them to do even more, how do you think of yourself as being in this broader orchestra where each one of us is learning to play our part and we're all working together to do even more? This is a youth leadership development for reforms, a case study that was in Kenya, and we trained up 80 college students to be mentors, and then 20 students to actually be leadership trainers. And together they went out and actually were combating some of the post-election violence in Kenya in 2007 and 2008. And so they were doing skits and everything to help educate the community about what could be done to respond to the inner strife that was taking place after this election. And it was amazing. They ended up reaching about 2,400 people. And so the question I really want you to, and really want to leave you with is, what would the world look like if young people everywhere were provided leadership development? And how can we be developing that capacity in other people? Thank you.